What makes a full game? Is Final Fantasy VII Remake released in 2020 such a game? Or is it something else? Should players wait for the full experience before playing? And what does all of this actually have to do with pizza? Hello everyone, I'm Nökkvi from Birds of Play, and in this video, these are some of the things we'll be looking into in order to answer the question whether Final Fantasy VII Remake is a full game or not. As questions go, I don't think it's necessarily the best, but even seemingly bad questions can sometimes have very interesting answers, as they help us reevaluate or reinforce what we take for granted. In this case, how the concept of a full game should be defined in practice, and also to what extent Final Fantasy VII Remake can be said to be one. Now, some of you might be thinking that actually engaging with this question is tantamount to beating a dead horse, but this is something that still comes up fairly regularly, even though it's been more than a year since the game was released. So, from here on out, if you come across this type of argument, you can just post a link to this video, and hopefully that way the horse can stay dead. Not that I'm advocating for dead horses. But speaking of beating them, don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, becoming a part of our growing Final Fantasy family. We're currently working our way up to 1,000 subscribers, and would love for you to join us as an early bird or an early supporter, as someone who has clicked on this video and by extension believes Final Fantasy to be something worth discussing. But now, with that out of the way, we can actually start to answer the question at hand. So, compared to other media such as literature and film, video games seem to be in an almost constant state of flux, or at least we have come to expect for something to come along every now and then that revolutionizes the way we think about video games, while our understanding of literature and cinema remains relatively stable. Of course, film was revolutionized by the adoption of sound and color, and even more recently we could argue that streaming, as well as long serializations of intellectual properties such as the Marvel Cinematic Universe, have drastically changed not only how we think about what films are, but also how we consume them. In much the same way, video games have been revolutionized, but I would argue that it has been a lot more frequent occurrence, especially when considering that video games haven't been around all that long. In the relatively short lifespan of the medium, we've seen video games move from the arcades into our homes, changing not only where we play games, but also affecting what kind of games are made and how we pay for them. We're no longer expected to feed a bunch of coins into a machine for each play session, but instead we buy a full game to be played at our own leisure. We've seen graphics and processing power drastically improve in such a way that different generations of games look and play drastically different, in addition to these advancements affecting how long it takes to actually make state-of-the-art games, as well as how much it costs, production costs having been on the rise exponentially for quite a while now. We could also mention the so-called casual revolution, wherein browser games, mobile games, and more casual games made for dedicated gaming consoles such as the Wii forced us to rethink the concept of quote-unquote real games and real gamers by offering different games, different playstyles, as well as sometimes different payment models. But what does all of this have to do with Final Fantasy VII Remake and whether it's a full game or not? Well, just like our conceptions about what video games are in general are subject to change, so too is our understanding of what might or might not constitute a full game. But what actually is the alternative? For one thing, the game could be a demo, only representing a small part of the total experience. Maybe it could also just be unfinished, as many felt was the case with Final Fantasy XV before they added a bunch of stuff to it. A game could also be episodic or split up into different parts that were then intended to create a single unified experience. We could acknowledge that someone who claims that Final Fantasy VII Remake isn't a full game, but rather only a single episode, because it only tells a small part of the story present in the original game, and because it's only the first installment in a planned series of games, isn't all wrong. However, currently episodic gaming doesn't just refer to the serialization of games, but rather a specific way of developing and distributing games. Episodic games generally being shorter than other full commercial releases. They also contain less content than other full games, often making up for the lack of content by being released on a more frequent basis. However, since Final Fantasy VII Remake represents the labor typically associated with a full AAA title, it would be hard to claim that it's episodic in this conventional sense, and it would perhaps be more appropriate to compare the game to something like Assassin's Creed, where an overarching narrative is being told in a number of full games. To describe Final Fantasy VII Remake as an episodic game, therefore, would mean that we would have to sort of redefine what episodic gaming actually means, which of course isn't out of the question. However, that would be kind of redundant in this case, because most of the time when people make the case that Final Fantasy VII Remake isn't a full game, they are doing so in an effort to undermine or to dismiss it as something not worth our time or attention. And if the definition of episodic gaming would be extended to include what we currently understand to be full games, the criticism would lose most of its meaning. The main reason that a lot of people have a problem with the way the series is set up is that the original Final Fantasy VII was only one game, but there's nothing that says that an adaptation or a remake has to mimic the exact number of units the source material was presented in. When Game of Thrones was adapted for television, for example, each episode didn't correspond to a chapter or a book from the original series of books. Also, you can say what you want about the Hobbit film trilogy, but there's nothing that says that a single book can't be made into more than a single film. But just like with the Hobbit films, a lot of players have expressed the sentiment that spreading the Final Fantasy VII saga across multiple games is just a cash grab, or a case of trying to milk the franchise dry. Now, I'm not going to argue that Square Enix isn't trying to maximize their profits by making the remake a multi-part game series, but the term cash grab has rather negative connotations, implying a product that has little or zero quality and is thrown together rather hastily or lazily, having no heart or soul, and having been made with the sole purpose of making money. Looking at the Final Fantasy VII Remake with this in mind, it becomes fairly difficult to think of it as a cash grab in this sense, since it's recognizably a high-quality game, more than able to compete with other AAA titles in the modern market. The game is also full of heart and soul, in the sense that the developers have taken many, let's say, unnecessary creative liberties in an attempt to revitalize the game for a new age. Now, you may not like what they have done, but the fact that it's different enough for fans of the original to notice sort of goes to show that there is quite a bit of creativity that has gone into the game, for better or for worse. So, we've already discussed how Final Fantasy VII Remake should be considered a full game, and that referring to it as an episode, at least as a derogatory term, requires redefining what episodic gaming currently means, making the claim somewhat meaningless, since it would just be redefined as what we currently call a full game. We've also discussed how the game isn't a cash grab, since a cash grab isn't just a company trying to make money, but rather trying to do so in a way that is lazy and lacks heart. Final Fantasy VII Remake being both a state-of-the-art modern game, as well as filled with creativity, disqualifying it as a cash grab in that sense. But no matter how we define it, one thing is for sure: this is not the last installment in the series. So what about the people that say they're not going to touch it until they can play the quote-unquote full experience? Well, for one thing, we could tell them they will be waiting quite a while, but we could also tell them that Final Fantasy VII Remake already is a full experience. Not in the sense that the whole story is complete, but rather in the sense that the game isn't just a full game, but also represents a single finished or complete project of development. This multi-part series of games will consist of multiple projects with a beginning and end cycle, each one consisting of full AAA development. Which also brings us back to the cash grab, because people who claim that selling Final Fantasy VII Remake as multiple games is bad for consumers seem to misunderstand the amount of work that goes into these games. Sure, the next installment will no doubt build on the first one, but it doesn't represent just another piece of the same pie. It's a totally different pie. Or maybe I should say pizza pie, because we're talking about Final Fantasy VII and those guys love their pizza. So yeah, Final Fantasy VII Remake is a whole pizza, baked to completion with the finest ingredients available at the moment. Just like with any unique pizza though, the toppings might not be to everyone's liking, but it's nevertheless a full experience and deserves to be bought at the price of a complete pizza. And what's the DLC with Yuffie in this analogy? What, you never had dessert before? In closing, there are plenty of ways to productively criticize Final Fantasy VII Remake, but claiming that it's not a full game is nothing short of empty rhetoric, intended to undermine as opposed to analyze the actual subject at hand. We can do better, I think. especially as we wait for the rest of the pizzas to arrive to what is shaping up to become a really long pizza party.
Peter here. Thanks for watching, yo. If you made it to this point, you're probably subscribed already. If so, thanks so much. If not, then well obviously I think you should. But you know, don't listen to me, I'm biased. Bird sounds. Caca, yo.